Squax Bessia Bisin Cusceli. Come press yet trois. Lupes Husted Luisilus Estema School. Lupin Peep a hot come press yet trois. As what wheeled. Come hatlu. Quesuitlu. Ne East. Come tap gas yaptin Lutz Eden. Come ip quetsum lunek elch alcane. Yet trois. Fix. Tunum was. Come in conmeintlu. Asiatluk sqadlich was all qshitu. Akes meeltum lun kulmisluk khwalchmush. Good day and welcome to Indian Time again. I'd like to welcome everyone to the show and remember today on the what is it 24th. Today is Louise Lamuse Combs' 100th birthday today. She'll be celebrating it with her family in the next few days. Louise is a person that has seen a lot of things over the years. She's was married to Abel Combs for 69 years before Abel passed away. They had 2 children. They were Richard and Margaret, and the last time she was interviewed, she said she had too many tupias and ilauyas and to remember all of them and how many. So I'd like to wish Louise happy birthday. Louise, folks, her parents were John and Adelaide Lamuse. Her parental grandparents were Pierre and Lucy Lamuse. Maternal grandparents was Medicine Pierre and Rosie Pellew. Louise went to school at the Ursulines and Cushman boarding school in Tacoma, and I know she enjoys powwows. All the years that I've attended the powwows, I've always seen her there, and she just really enjoys watching the dancers out there. So Louise, I hope and wish you the best today for your 100th anniversary or birthday. Come khaslu et khwatwas khalkhal come khastu tunek elchichin kospens come tunek yapqin come khatlwaks yapqin et khwatlu kuin pokhot when khulchmotion let's eat and we kes may to good misluk khulchmotion et khwakus lemtem kun chinsen to yet khwatakun and qaqitlu eat which was good. And I hope that Louise has a great time when she celebrates. Well, today I'd like to say that 145 years ago, we're going to talk about something that very little people think about. Today, I think we're going to, let's see, our place name for today will be, I think, Kwaslintsame, which is Post Creek. Kwaslintsame is got its name because of a formation in the water in the stream there. There was trees around there. It was kind of like an opening and kind of a heel in the opening. So Kwaslintsame is what the Salish people call it. Today, this month is October. Sleep. Which is a hunting month. A lot of people are out camping and hunting. We want to discuss that a little bit more at the next show. But today we want to talk about something that happened 145 years ago. About this time of the year, on October 17th, the Salish and Ponderay made a treaty with the United States government and with other tribes. This isn't as well known as the Hellgate Treaty. The Hellgate Treaty was made on July 16th of 1855. This other treaty, called the Judith River Treaty, was made in October of 1855. Today, again, we bring Thomas Smith, a historian working with the Salish Pend Oreille Culture Committee, visit with me about the Judith River Treaty. Tom has done a lot of research and done a lot of work for the Culture Committee for the history book, and so I depend on Tom a lot to remember these things and look for these things. So Tom, tell us about the treaty. What was the objective of this treaty, and who took part in it?
Well, thanks for having me here to talk about it, Tony. And it's this treaty was another one of the Isaac Stevens treaties, just as the Hellgate Treaty was, and many of the other treaties that were made across what's now Washington State, Idaho, and Montana in that period, 1854, 1855. And the purpose of the Judith River Treaty was really to define the hunting territories east of the mountains of all the different tribes. The Blackfeet, the Crow, the Salish, the Pend Oreille, the Gros Ventre, other tribes, and so they wanted to define those territories, and by doing so to reduce the warfare between the different tribes that was increasing. As the buffalo numbers were decreasing, the intensity of those intertribal wars was increasing, and so the tribes, of course, who for many years by that time had already been trying to establish peace between each other, had a natural interest in doing that. But Isaac Stevens also had an interest in establishing this peace for another motive. It wasn't simply kind of a good-hearted intention of making peace between the tribes. He also wanted to, one of the reasons they wanted to eliminate that intertribal warfare was so that commerce could increase across the plains, and so that they could begin to proceed towards a day when they would build railroads across North America and establish commerce and a market economy. As long as these tribes were kind of ruling that area and overseeing it through the tribal ways, it was a real impediment in the eyes of Isaac Stevens and the other U.S. officials towards establishing that market economy. So, as usual with these treaties, there's an economic motive that's part of the real objective behind it. So Stevens had actually been having this kind of treaty in mind for quite a while, and there was an effort to make this treaty happen a year earlier, but this was a huge logistical nightmare to try to make this happen, because he was trying to bring together about 10,000 different Indian people to the Judith River area to make this treaty. And of course, just the food necessary to support that many people was a huge problem. So he had this whole system of sending out couriers and keeping in contact with the different tribal groups that were kind of all through the area east of the mountains there, to try to time things just right, so that at the time when the treaty could finally happen, he'd bring them all to that spot. But as I say, so we see his objectives in the treaty, and as we see so often in these treaty meetings, the motives of the Indian people going into them, I think, was different. And they truly had an interest in reducing that intertribal warfare. As I say, as the buffalo began to decline in numbers, that warfare between tribes is increasing, and there were more people dying. Now, of course, warfare was carried on with guns instead of bows and arrows, and there was naturally a higher mortality that was occurring by that time.
At that time, I think there was really a start and a change in the way of the Indian people's way of life, and I think warfare, became a big part of it because of survival.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that I think a treaty that was probably needed in order for the smaller tribes to survive. So in many ways, this treaty different from the Hellgate Treaty, huh?
Yeah, in a number of ways it's different from Hellgate, but along the point you were just making too about that change in intertribal warfare, I think traditionally when the buffalo were almost limitless in numbers, the warfare between the tribes was largely reaffirming the boundaries between the tribes and reaffirming identity, so that counting coup on an opposing warrior was probably just as important as killing them, and the warfare tended to be low in mortality, so that if just one or two people died in a battle, that was a big deal. And this is all across North America. I remember reading an interview with an elder of the Delaware tribe, some of whom actually came out with the Salish, as you know, and eventually, but back in the 1600s, they said it would be a rare thing for 7 of our people to die in 7 years of warfare. And that was something you heard all across North America. But this was a different treaty from Hellgate. Hellgate Treaty was really a more typical land treaty in that it was establishing a reservation and establishing the way that the lands that would be ceded to the U.S. government. Not that the tribes gave up all rights on those lands either. They reserved many rights, including the right to hunt and fish and gather and use them in the traditional ways. But the Hellgate Treaty reserved lands for the tribe's exclusive use and benefit, and the Flathead Reservation was part of that land base. This treaty was really, although it did establish some lands for the Blackfeet and so on, the main purpose of it was kind of dividing up the hunting grounds east of the mountains. So that was the main difference. This is primarily a peace treaty. The other was primarily a land treaty. And of course, you know, that's one of the interesting things in the Hellgate Treaty too, is that at one point during the negotiations, according to the Jesuit observer there, Adrian Hoken, he said that the tribal leaders showed their hands unstained by blood and said, "Why are we having a treaty? We haven't been at war. There's no blood on our hands." And that probably suggests something that we'll talk about in a minute or two about the translation problem, that they didn't understand exactly what the U.S. was up to in this treaty about getting all that cession of land, all that land from the tribes into the U.S.'s control.
Okay. I know there's a lot of things that's taken place, and a lot of people remember the Hellgate Treaty. But, what kind of records have we got on this treaty?
Well, it's pretty similar to the Hellgate Treaty in that we have the minutes of the negotiations, and then we have the treaty document itself. We don't have some of the other things that accompany the Hellgate Treaty. For instance, what I just mentioned, those letters of the Jesuit observers, which are pretty helpful in fleshing out a little bit of the Hellgate Treaty. For neither treaty is there a whole lot in the recorded oral histories at the Culture Committee. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe if the oral history project had been started a bit earlier, there'd be some more. There are some references to the treaty in interviews with elders that were done by people earlier, like John Ewers, who came out to interview people about the treaty in the late 40s, and James Tate, the ethnographer who worked out here briefly around 1908 in that era. But other than the government records, we don't have a whole lot to go on.
Okay, with that, let's take a short break here, and then we'll be right back with more questions.
Hello, here's some more fruit and vegetable news that you can enjoy. Now, a wonderfully economical way to feed a large family is a great big pot of homemade vegetable soup or stew. And one way to boost the texture of it and to get some additional nutritional punch is to add pureed vegetables like turnips or spinach or kale. Here, what I did is I roasted several turnips and then I pureed them afterwards in a blender. And then just scrape scrape up just a little of this and just slosh it into the soup or the stew. Now, what you've got, instead of having to add flour as a thickening, you've got vegetables as a thickening. And it gives the most wonderfully textured base to that. Great flavor. So you could spend, say, an hour on a Sunday afternoon, and you've got a hearty meal that'll keep for a week and makes sensational leftovers too. So go on, do yourself a flavor, look at that, and enjoy your 5 or more servings of fruit and vegetables every day. Oh my goodness, the flavor, look at the texture that you get from that and the flavor that you get from it at the same time. Wonderfully, wonderfully good idea.
Welcome back. Thank you. Remember the word, the place name of the day, which is Postkrieg, and also the month of October is called Shlip Spakanis. Today I have Tom Smith from the Salish Pend Oreille Cultural Committee discussing some of the issues of the Judith River Treaty, which I think is little known and little discussed. Tom, the tribes from here, took part in the treaty far east of the mountains. It was made east of the mountains. Why were these tribes involved?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of people might be surprised by that, but actually before the time of when horses and guns came in, which actually came in ahead of white people themselves, these horses traded from tribe to tribe, and also guns, which came through the fur trade, but were also traded from tribe to some degree. Before that era, and before the time when European diseases came in and really began to change the whole intertribal world in Montana, the Salish were based more east of the mountains than they were west of the mountains. There were about 5 major bands of Salish, according to most of the research that's been done and what the elders have told us. There were large bands based around Butte, that's just west of the mountains, but pretty close, around Helena, around the Bozeman area, and around Three Forks. Was a major area for the Salish. And the Pend Oreille too, although they were always based mostly west of the mountains, there was a band called the Tunachen that were based on the east side, the Rocky Mountain front. And that's an interesting word because I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but the Kootenai word Tunacha is so similar. But there's so much interesting oral history around this, and it sounds like there was a Salish-speaking people, and we have some of the words that survive from their language that Blind Mose Chowta and some other elders remembered and passed down. But a Salish-speaking people that were associated more with the Pend Oreille, I guess, than with the Salish that were on the east front of the Rockies. So there's an very old relationship with that land east of the mountains for the tribes here, the Salish-speaking tribes here, and used that from time immemorial. And in fact, one kind of document that also survived from this Judith River Treaty that I forgot to mention are these pieces of correspondence when they were trying to get the treaty set up in the weeks leading up to the treaty. They'd send these couriers out to the different bands, and they'd write back and say, where people were camped and whether they were still intending to attend the treaty, and so on. And the Pend Oreille under Alexander were camped mostly along the Smith River during those weeks, and it was clear that that was a place they were used to going to and had used for forever. And one of the most interesting exchanges in this treaty, and really the reason this treaty is most interesting to me in working on the history project, is that before the Pend Oreille got there, some of the Piegan were already there and had been meeting with Stevens. and had kind of prearranged with Stevens that the whole area around the Sweetgrass Hills would be exclusively for the Blackfeet to use. And the buffalo hunting country that would be designated for the Pend d'Oreille and the Salish would be more along the Musselshell and the Yellowstone, further to the south. And those were areas that the Pend d'Oreille and Salish certainly had used for a long time. In fact, we have 13 Salish place names along the Musselshell River that were gathered back in the 30s by an anthropologist named Claude Schaefer, who interviewed some Salish elders, Paul Antoine and some other Salish elders. So they did use those areas, but this idea of the Sweetgrass Hills being reserved for the Piegan and Blackfeet to use exclusively, when Alexander showed up and heard that, he really confronted the people there. And he said, I thought this was a peace treaty, and yet this is a country that we've always used, that my father told me about and said that our people had always used, and that it's a place we go to hunt buffalo, and very old relationship with that area. And interestingly enough, the Piegan immediately backed down from trying to claim exclusive use over it and said, well, okay, it'll be a shared area. But interestingly enough, there's so many of these treaties, the railroad agreement, which we discussed in an earlier show, the Hellgate Treaty, this treaty, where what's said in the negotiations for the treaty is different from what's in the final agreement that people put their X mark on. And I think in the final language of this treaty, the Sweetgrass Hills is defined as the Blackfeet's area for hunting buffalo, and not for the Salish and Pend d'Oreille, even though during the negotiation, both the Pend d'Oreille and the Blackfeet agreed that it would be shared. And Alexander's really the only person, as far as I remember from those minutes, that's recorded in the minutes as speaking. Chief Victor of the Salish is there, but I think he's kind of deferring to Alexander more because it's more in that northern area, so it's more the Pend d'Oreille hunting grounds, I guess, than it is the Salish. So
I remember my Uncle Pete Beaver had at one time told me that this is the area that they went to, and that I think it's his great-great-grandmother who was along with them at the time. She was getting up there in age when she went along with this group of people and through there, and she passed away up there, and she's buried at the foothills of the Sweetgrass Hills. So I know that I know from those recent stories that we're connected to that.
yeah, and we still have place names for the Sweetgrass Hills, right?
Right.
Yes.
Right. And we look back in history, and we all of these negotiations and these treaties and that took place between the different tribes and the government, and they had to use interpreters. How do you think these interpreters and translators affected the treaties?
Well, they had a huge effect. I remember visiting with Agnes Vanderburg not too long before she passed away, and how she said to me, one of the main things to remember in the history is the problem of translation. And she said, I always blame it on the translators, that the bad deals that the tribes often got when you read the language that's finally written down, that they just didn't know English well enough, and of course the non-Indians who were there knew nothing of Salish. So in fact, the translator who was at the Hellgate Treaty was the same translator who served at the Judith River Treaty, a guy named Ben Kaiser, who I assume is an ancestor of the Kaisers, Mary Kaiser and so on, that were later on the reservation here. But he must have been one of the first ones of the Kaisers around here, because one of those letters from the Jesuit observers at the Hellgate Treaty, Adrian Hoken, one of the most interesting and disturbing lines in his letter is when he talks about the translation, and he says, Ben Kaiser knows English very poorly and doesn't know Salish much better. and he's the one that they're relying on. And he said the quality of the translation made the whole Hellgate Treaty negotiation a farce, and he said not a tenth of what was said was understood by either side. So that's one of the most interesting documents surrounding these treaties of 1855. And so we can assume the same thing's true over at Judith River, same problem of translation.
Okay, and we know that translating, from one language to another is very difficult, and it loses, translation. Mm-hmm. We know that in dealing with our translating our tapes that we have from Salish to English, how difficult that is, that we lose a lot of the meaning when we translated that from Salish to English. So right. I imagine that a lot of the treaties, a lot of the negotiations that took place between the United States and the Indian tribes through interpreter was misinterpreted time and time again.
I would think definitely. I mean, the many of the concepts that Isaac Stevens and the other white officials were trying to communicate were just foreign concepts too. Mm-hmm. I don't know how some of those could have been translated.
Well, we're out of time again, and I'd like to thank you again, Tom. And I'm going to bring Tom again at our next show to discuss some more hunting, and then we want to talk about hopefully the Swan area. And with that, I'd like to say happy birthday, Louise, again, for your 100th. I hope that you're well today, and the word of today, or place name of the day, good day, thank you.